In the next, I think it's like 1/20th of a second, your brain is going to make this permanent, totally subconscious judgment about whatever you're looking at right now.
Yeah, 1/20th of a second. It's incredibly fast.
Right. And you haven't read a single word of text yet. You haven't consciously processed the geometric shapes or, the layout.
You really haven't processed anything logical at all.
Exactly. In that tiny fraction of a heartbeat, you've really only registered one specific thing, and that's color.
Just color.
It's basically a biological trigger. It tells your brain exactly how to feel before your logical mind even has a chance to boot up.
I mean, it really is the ultimate shortcut in human perception, and it is entirely ruthless.
Ruthless is a good word for it.
Because that 1/20th of a second, that dictates whether a consumer buys a product or whether a warning label actually stops someone from making a fatal error.
Yeah, or even if a piece of digital art makes you feel dread instead of comfort.
Precisely. We are constantly navigating this incredibly dense visual environment,
Yes.
right? And the people who actually construct that environment,
The designers.
right, the designers, they're pulling these levers in our brains that most of us don't even know exist.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because our mission today for this deep dive is to completely demystify those exact levers.
Which is no small task.
No, it's huge. But we're going to shortcut your way to becoming a master of visual communication. We're going to explore the underlying physics, the biology, and the deep psychological frameworks of color.
We have some incredible source material for this.
We do. We are pulling all of this from a single, incredibly dense foundational text. For those of you listening who want to look it up, we're looking at Chapter 01, Communicating with Colors pages from Design Elements, Color Fundamentals, a graphic style manual for understanding how color affects design.
It's a mouthful of a title, but it is basically the Bible for this stuff.
It really is. And the thing about this text is, well, it forces you to abandon a lot of really comforting assumptions.
Oh, almost immediately.
Because to understand how color functions as a tool of communication, you first have to accept this rather unsettling physical reality.
Yeah, the physics of it are kind of mind-blowing when you first realize it.
Yeah.
We tend to think of color as an inherent property of an object, you know.
Like you look at a fire engine and you assume the redness is a physical characteristic baked right into the metal.
Right, baked into the metal and the paint of that truck.
That the red is literally on the truck, but the text comes right out and shatters that. It states that color, as the concrete physical object, doesn't technically exist.
It doesn't. It is entirely a fabrication of our neurological hardware.
Which sounds like sci-fi.
I know, but physically, all that actually exists out there in the universe are varying wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, light energy.
Just waves of energy bouncing around.
Exactly. And the visible spectrum for humans is just this incredibly narrow band of wavelengths, roughly between 400 and 700 nanometers.
Okay, so when those waves of energy strike a surface, like the paint on that fire engine we talked about,
The chemical composition of that surface absorbs certain wavelengths and reflects others back out into the environment.
okay, so I was trying to visualize this mechanical process while reading, and I came up with an analogy. Tell me if the physics hold up here.
I love a good analogy. Let's hear it.
Think of the physical surface of an object. Let's use a bright blue physical coffee mug as a highly selective nightclub bouncer.
A bouncer. Okay.
Right. So white light, which is the entire visible spectrum of wavelengths traveling together, rolls up to the door of the club.
The club being the mug.
Yes. And the bouncer, which represents the specific molecular structure of the mug's glaze, looks at the crowd of wavelengths and it absorbs almost everyone.
It kicks them out.
Exactly. It kicks out the red waves, the yellow waves, the green waves. They all get absorbed as heat.
Right.
The only wavelength that lets bounce past the velvet rope and travel into our eyes is the blue wavelength. So the mug isn't inherently blue. The mug is literally everything except blue. Blue is just the energy it rejected.
That analogy works perfectly for the physical absorption of light on tangible objects.
Yes.
But here we have to be careful because that analogy completely falls apart when you start talking about screens and digital design.
Oh, right. Because there's no physical paint.
Exactly. Which is where the vast majority of visual communication happens today anyway. Your bouncer analogy relies on what we call the subtractive color model.
Subtractive meaning subtracting wavelengths from white light.
Yes. But if you're designing on, say, an OLED monitor, there is no bouncer. There is no white light hitting a surface.
Because the screen is doing the glowing.
The screen itself is the light source. It's directly firing specific wavelengths of red, green, and blue photons straight into your retina.
Directly into your eye.
Yeah, that's the additive model. But honestly, whether it's reflected light from a mug or projected light from a phone, the fundamental trigger is exactly the same.
A specific frequency of energy enters the pupil and hits the back of the eye.
Right, which is where the biological translation actually happens.
And the text goes deep into the optical system here, specifically the photoreceptor cells, right? The rods and cones.
Yes, and understanding this division of labor between rods and cones is, well, it's critical for literally everything we are going to discuss about visual hierarchy.
So break that down for me. Cones first.
Okay, so cones are the photoreceptors responsible for translating those specific wavelengths into the experience we call hue. So color.
But there's a biological catch, isn't there? The manual really emphasizes
It's a
this.
huge catch. Cones require a massive amount of light energy to function. They are incredibly light hungry.
Which explains the environmental dependency the book outlines. The lighting conditions completely alter your perceived reality.
Exactly. When the ambient light drops, like at sunset, your cones literally begin to shut down.
Wow.
They just don't have enough photon data to trigger the chemical reaction that tells your brain, hey, this is red or this is green.
And the text called this the Purkinje shift, right?
Yes, the Purkinje shift. As twilight sets in, the red wavelengths fade from our perception first, and the shorter blue wavelengths actually appear artificially brighter for a little bit.
But eventually it just gets too dark.
Right, eventually the cones tap out completely and your vision shifts entirely over to the rods.
And rods don't see hue at all, do they?
Not at all. They only process the intensity of the light, so luminance, light and dark.
Which means, and this is a crazy thought experiment, if you are looking at a dark red apple and a dark green leaf in a very dimly lit room,
You biologically lose the ability to tell them apart.
they just become identical muddy grays.
Totally. Which proves the foundational premise of the entire manual. Color is this highly fragile, incredibly context-dependent interaction between physics and biology.
If the light changes, the communication fails.
Exactly. So if you're a designer trying to build a system that relies on these incredibly unstable wavelengths, how do you actually guarantee your message gets across?
You have to isolate the variables. You have to define the absolute mechanics of what we're looking at before you can start combining them into a complex message.
Right, we need the vocabulary of vision.
Vocabulary of vision, I like that. And the manual breaks this down into 4 architectural pillars, right?
It does. Hue, saturation, temperature, and value.
And we really have to move past the elementary school definitions here.
Oh, absolutely. Because these terms represent very specific mathematical and biological EFs.
Let's start with hue, because I think it's the simplest. In this context, hue is essentially synonymous with the word color, right?
Basically, yeah. It is the specific wavelength location on the spectrum. So 470 nanometers is the hue we call blue. 650 nanometers is the hue we call red.
It's the baseline identity.
Exactly. It's the identity.
Yeah.
But identity alone isn't enough to build visual structure, which brings us to the second pillar, saturation.
Or as the text sometimes refers to it, chroma.
Right. And most people think of saturation simply as how bright or dull a color is, like turning up the dial on a TV.
Yeah, that's how I always thought of it.
But chemically and physically, it's really about the purity of the wavelength.
How pure the signal is before it hits the cones in your eye.
Exactly. A pure, highly saturated hue is basically a highly concentrated blast of a single wavelength. There is no white light or black pigment interfering with the signal.
It's just screaming that one note.
Yes. Because the signal is so pure, it hits the cones in your eye with absolute maximum intensity.
Which sounds exhausting for the eye.
It is. That is exactly why highly saturated colors are incredibly demanding to look at for long periods. They physically fatigue the visual cortex.
So desaturation, on the other hand.
Desaturation introduces noise into the signal. You're mixing in white, black, or gray, which literally scatters the light.
Just the tones get a break.
Exactly. The cones don't have to work as hard, which is why desaturated palettes tend to feel more sophisticated or grounded or calming.
Okay, that makes complete sense biologically. It's like the difference between listening to a pure, piercing sine wave versus listening to the complex, layered hum of ambient white noise.
That's a great way to put it.
But then we hit the third pillar, temperature. And the manual gets incredibly specific here, noting that color temperature is measured in degrees Kelvin.
The Kelvin scale, yes.
And I've always found this counterintuitive, because in everyday life we associate red and orange with fire and heat, right? We associate blue with ice and cold.
Naturally, yeah.
But scientifically, physically, the Kelvin scale is the exact opposite.
It is, and this is a crucial technical constraint for anyone working in digital design. The Kelvin scale is based on blackbody radiation.
Right. Explain how that works.
So imagine you heat up a theoretical block of carbon. At first, as it gets warm, it glows a dull, dark red.
Like embers in a fire.
Exactly. But as you increase the physical heat, the energy increases, and the glow shifts. It goes to orange, then yellow, then a stark white, and finally, at its absolute hottest, it burns a brilliant, piercing blue.
Like a blowtorch.
Exactly. So biologically, we categorize reds and yellows as warm because they remind us of a campfire or a sunset.
But physically?
Physically, the higher color temperatures, the stuff up in the 6,500 to 9,000 Kelvin range, those are the blues and the greens.
And the manual points out that this physical reality heavily dictates digital workspaces. Like, a monitor's default white point is usually around 6,500 Kelvin.
Which has a distinct bluish, cool tint to it compared to, say, a standard incandescent light bulb in your living room.
Right, so if you're a designer...
If you don't calibrate your monitor to account for that ambient physical temperature, your entire palette is being built on a lie.
Oh, wow.
Seriously, you might spend hours selecting this warm, inviting, desaturated orange for a brand identity. But if your screen is pushing a 9,000 Kelvin backlight...
You are artificially cooling that shoe without even realizing it.
Exactly. And when that design finally gets printed on a physical substrate, like a billboard, or viewed on a calibrated mobile device, it will look entirely different. The temperature of the medium overrides the intention of the designer.
Which sounds like an incredibly expensive mistake to make.
It happens all the time.
But even if you calibrate everything perfectly, the manual argues that hue, saturation, and temperature all take a backseat to the fourth and arguably most dominant pillar.
Yes, value.
Value, the relative degree of lightness or darkness of a color, regardless of its hue.
Value is the absolute core of visual communication, period.
The manual goes way out of its way to elevate value above everything else, right? It states that it is actually capable of overriding color itself.
It is.
If we go back to the biology of the eye for a second, is this because of the rods we were talking about?
It is entirely because of the rods. We talked about how cones process hue, but remember, they are slow and require a lot of light. Your rods, however, process value, lightness, and darkness.
And we have a lot more of those, don't we?
Way more. You have significantly more rods than cones in your retina. Because evolutionarily, we didn't need to know the exact hue of a predator hiding in the brush to survive.
We just needed to spot the movement.
Right. We just needed to detect the dark shape moving against the lighter background. We need to detect contrast.
So our brains process differences in value much faster than differences in hue.
Exponentially faster.
Yeah.
If you look at a complex composition, like a website layout or a movie poster or a dashboard, your eye is instantly drawn to the area of highest value contrast.
Where the lightest element meets the darkest element.
Every single time. That is where the eye lands first. You can have a chaotic mix of 50 different, highly saturated hues, but if they all share the exact same underlying value...
Like if they're all equally medium dark.
Yeah. If the values are identical, the composition will look completely flat. The eye will have nowhere to go. It just slides right off.
Okay, let me challenge that hierarchy a bit, just as a pushback.
Go for it.
If value is so incredibly powerful, if it's the biological mechanism that dictates exactly where the viewer's eye goes, why do designers spend hours agonizing over ocean blue versus cerulean blue?
That's a fair question.
Right. If value is doing all the structural heavy lifting, why does the manual spend so much time dissecting hue?
What's fascinating here is that you are dealing with two entirely different cognitive systems. Value creates the structure, but hue creates the emotion.
Oh, interesting.
Think of it structurally, like architecture. Value is the load-bearing steel framework of a building. It establishes where the walls are, where the floor is, and it explicitly directs the traffic. It tells people exactly where the front door is.
Okay, so if your values are wrong.
The building collapses into a muddy, unreadable mess. People literally won't know where to look or what to click.
Right.
Hue, on the other hand, is the interior design of that building.
Oh, I see.
It's the texture on the walls, the ambient lighting, the stylistic flair. Hue tells the user how to feel when they walk through that front door.
So if it's a clinical, high-trust banking application, you use a deeply desaturated cool blue.
Exactly. Or if it is a high-energy fitness brand, you use a highly saturated warm orange. Hue dictates the psychological mood, but without the value structure underneath it.
Nobody ever finds the door to begin with.
You got it.
So value directs the traffic of the eyeball, and hue sets the mood of the journey. That division of labor makes perfect sense.
And the text provides these amazing visual value scales to prove it, showing how our perception of a color's brightness is never absolute.
Right, it is entirely relative to the darker or lighter tones immediately surrounding it, which is the perfect transition into the architecture of harmony.
Because up until this point, we've really only been talking about these pillars as isolated variables.
A single wavelength of blue, a single value of gray.
But in the real world, colors are never viewed in a vacuum. They're always next to something else.
They crash into each other. And to map out those collisions, the manual relies on the traditional color wheel. But instead of just listing off, red, yellow, and blue, we need to look at the advanced mechanics of how these positions on the wheel actually interact.
Because there's a very specific, almost mathematical tension happening here.
Yeah, the geometry of the wheel is basically designed to predict human biological reactions.
Let's look at analogous colors first.
Yeah.
These are hues sitting immediately adjacent to each other on the wheel.
Like a deep violet, a blue violet, and a true blue.
Right, we are talking about wavelengths that are mathematically very similar.
I was trying to map this to physics. Is an analogous palette essentially optical constructive interference?
How do you mean?
Like, because the wavelengths are so close together in frequency, they don't fight for dominance in the eye. They just blend into the smooth, unified wave.
That is a highly precise way to think about it, actually.
Yeah.
The cones in your eye are not forced to rapidly switch gears. The signal transitions smoothly.
Which is why an analogous palette inherently feels unified, calm, and organic.
Right, it requires very little cognitive effort to process.
Right.
But then you look at the complete opposite geometry on the wheel. Complementary colors.
Hues located directly opposite each other across the center of the wheel. Red and green, blue and orange.
The manual describes their relationship as fundamentally contradictory. They are simultaneously attracted to and repelled by each other.
Yeah, the visual vibration.
Exactly. When you place a pure, highly saturated red directly next to a pure, highly saturated green, the edge where those two colors meet literally appears to vibrate or glow. It creates visual noise.
But why does it vibrate? I mean, if an analogous palette is smooth because the wavelengths are similar, what is physically happening in the eye to make complementary colors create that jarring electric edge?
It's pretty wild.
Because I always hear designers call it a push-pull tension, but that just sounds like poetry. What is the actual mechanism?
Okay, so it comes down to a neurological process called lateral inhibition.
Lateral inhibition.
Yes. When the ganglion cells in your retina are hit with a pure red wavelength, they fire off a signal to the brain. But the specific cells that process red are inherently linked to the cells that process green.
Like they're wired together?
They operate on an opponent channel. You cannot perceive a greenish red. The biology physically prevents it.
Oh, wow. I never thought about that. But you're right. You can picture a yellowish green, but not a greenish red?
Exactly. So when you put a pure red immediately next to a pure green, your retinal cells are essentially screaming at each other.
They're fighting.
The red receptors are firing at maximum capacity, and right next to them, the green receptors are firing at maximum capacity, and they're actively trying to inhibit one another.
That's like acoustic phase cancellation, or bringing two positively charged magnets together. They physically reject each other's frequencies.
That visual vibration you see is your neurological hardware literally struggling to resolve two violently opposing signals sharing the exact same spatial boundary.
That is incredible. And this brings us to a really profound insight in the manual regarding the concept of harmony. Because in everyday vernacular, we usually equate harmony with peace.
A gentle breeze, a quiet room.
Right, spa music.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, in the deep mechanics of visual design, harmony does not mean peaceful. Harmony means achieving the intended reaction.
Oh, that completely reframes the entire concept for me.
Think about it. If the colors are working together to execute a specific cognitive goal, they are harmonious.
So if you are designing an emergency exit sign or a poster for a chaotic, aggressive punk rock festival,
You do not want the smooth, constructive interference of an analogous palette.
Exactly.
That would be a massive failure of communication.
you want the jarring, screaming, lateral inhibition of complementary colors.
Exactly. That retinal tension is harmonious with the message of urgency or aggression.
So harmony is really just operational effectiveness. It's the wavelengths agreeing on the mission, even if the mission is to be totally abrasive.
Precisely. And the wheel gives designers incredibly complex tools to modulate that tension. You have triadic harmonies, 3 colors evenly spaced around the wheel.
Like a triangle, which gives you high contrast but a more balanced energy than direct complements.
Right, and then you have split complements.
Explain that one.
That's where you take a base hue, but instead of using its direct opposite, you use the 2 colors immediately adjacent to its opposite.
So it softens the vibration. You still get the structural contrast, but you lower the lateral inhibition just enough so the eye doesn't fatigue as quickly.
Yes, exactly. But as mathematically perfect as the color wheel is, the manual takes a very sharp turn right about here.
It does.
It establishes all these precise geometric rules, and then it essentially tells the reader, now forget the math because the human brain is going to ruin it.
Yes. Here is where it gets really interesting. Section 4 of the manual moves away from the pure physics of light and dives headfirst into the messy, highly subjective psychology of perception.
And it leans heavily on the teachings of the legendary Bauhaus masters, specifically Johannes Itten and Joseph Albers.
The Bauhaus was this radically influential school of design in Germany in the 1920s, right?
It was. Johannes Itten created the foundational color course there, and he was really one of the first to formally argue that while we can map wavelengths scientifically, our actual perception of color is entirely dictated by context and emotion.
And his student, Joseph Albers, took that idea of subjectivity and basically weaponized it. The manual mentions Albers' legendary book, Interaction of Color.
Oh, it's a classic.
There is this famous thought experiment he used to conduct with his students. He would tell a classroom of 50 people to close their eyes and imagine the color red.
Simple prompt.
Right, and he noted that he would inevitably get 50 entirely different psychological reds. One student imagines the metallic red of a sports car. Another imagines dried blood. Another imagines a cheap plastic toy.
It perfectly demonstrates the terrifying reality of visual communication. Even with a shared vocabulary, our internal experience of a hue is entirely private. You can never truly know if the specific 650 nanometer red you are outputting is being interpreted the exact same way by the viewer.
But Albers didn't just stop at imagination. He proved that even when 2 people are looking at the exact same physical color on the exact same surface, their perception of it can be violently manipulated based purely on what colors are sitting next to it.
Yes. The concept of simultaneous contrast.
The manual shows these mind-bending optical illusions from Albers' work to prove it.
They're iconic.
Yeah, they take 2 small squares of the exact same medium, flat gray. They place one of those gray squares in the center of a massive jet black background. And then they place the other identical gray square in the center of a stark white background.
And even though you logically know the ink used for the gray squares is physically identical,
Your visual cortex just overrides your logic. The gray square on the black background looks undeniably lighter, almost luminous, and the gray square on the white background looks incredibly dark and heavy.
because, again, your brain does not process isolated data points. It processes relationships.
The extreme brightness of the white background forces your optical system to compress the relative value of the gray.
It pushes it down the scale to create contrast. It is literally your brain dynamically adjusting the exposure of the image in real time.
Which means color is never absolute. It is a chameleon.
Completely. And the manual takes this concept of relational color even further with the Bezold effect.
Wilhelm von Bezold.
Yes, a German meteorologist and textile scientist in the late 19th century. He discovered a phenomenon that completely upends how we think about complex patterns.
Let's break down the mechanics of this because it feels like actual black magic when you see the visual examples in the text.
It really does.
Bezold discovered that if you have a highly complex, interwoven pattern, say, an intricate geometric web design that relies on 6 different interlocking colors, if you change just one of those colors,
It completely alters the perceived hue and value of all the other remaining colors in the entire pattern.
which is insane. How does that work?
It is the assimilation effect, which operates a bit differently than the contrast effect we just discussed with Albers.
Yeah.
In a highly detailed pattern where the colors are tightly interwoven, your eye doesn't have the space to process the sharp contrasting boundaries.
So what does it do instead?
The wavelengths begin to optically mix in the fluid of your eye before the signal even reaches the brain.
Optical mixing.
Yes. So imagine you have a complex tapestry of dark blues, deep reds, and forest greens, and you thread a bright, highly saturated yellow throughout the design.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
That yellow light physically scatters and bleeds into the adjacent dark colors. it artificially lightens the entire composition.
Wow.
And if you pull that single yellow thread out and replace it with a stark black thread, the red suddenly looks deeper, the blue looks heavier.
Even though you haven't touched the red or the blue ink.
Not at all. But by swapping out one single variable in the environment, the relationship dynamic of the entire group collapses and reforms.
It's a terrifying thought for a designer.
Oh, it's a nightmare.
You spend days perfecting a 5-color layout, and at the last minute, the client asks to change one minor accent color. And suddenly the Bezold effect kicks in, and the whole design looks muddy and unreadable.
Which is exactly why the manual stresses that you can never evaluate a color swatch in isolation on a white background.
It's a totally meaningless data point.
The color only reveals its true nature when it is forced to interact with its intended neighbors.
But the psychological weirdness doesn't stop at external context, does it? The manual also dives into the internal biological quirks of the brain that designers have to anticipate, like after imaging.
Ah, yes, the opponent process theory of vision. This is where we return to the concept of visual fatigue we touched on earlier. Our neurological system is desperately, constantly seeking equilibrium.
Our brains crave a neutral baseline.
Very much so.
The text outlines an experiment that listeners can actually try right now. If you stare intensely at a large block of highly saturated pure green for about 30 to 40 seconds.
You are flooding your retinal cones with a very specific aggressive wavelength.
Right. And if you then suddenly shift your gaze to a blank white piece of paper, your brain will project a glowing, ghost-like shape onto the paper. And the color of that ghost shape is pure red.
The exact mathematical complement of the green you were just looking at.
It is a biological failsafe, isn't it?
It is. The specific cones in your retina that process the green wavelength have been pushed to their absolute metabolic limit.
They are physically exhausted.
Exhausted and depleted of the photopigments required to fire that signal. When you look away at the white paper, which remember reflects all wavelengths simultaneously, the fatigued green cones cannot respond.
They're completely burnt out.
Exactly. So in that vacuum of information, the opposing channel in your ganglion cells overcompensates.
The red receptors.
The red receptors, which are fully rested, fire off a signal to try and pull your visual field back to a neutral, balanced state. Your brain artificially hallucinates the complementary color to soothe itself.
Our eyes literally just start making up colors to achieve biological symmetry. That is incredible.
Isn't it?
But from a practical standpoint, how does a designer deal with an audience whose brains are secretly hallucinating complementary colors in the background?
The manual argues that the most elite designers don't just deal with it, they actively weaponize it.
Weaponizing the hallucinations. I love it. Walk me through the mechanics of that.
If you know biologically that the human eye is in a constant state of searching for equilibrium, you hold the power to either grant that equilibrium or deliberately withhold it.
Okay.
If you build a layout using a highly calibrated complementary palette, let's say a specific deep teal blue paired with its exact mathematical complement, a burnt orange.
Like every movie poster ever made.
Exactly like every movie poster. When the viewer looks at that composition, their eye is simultaneously receiving the primary wavelength and the exact opposite wavelengths required to neutralize it.
You are feeding the eye the exact antidote it is looking for in real time.
Yes, the neurological channels are perfectly balanced. The viewer experiences a profound subconscious sense of satisfaction and completion. The design feels inherently right and deeply soothing, even if they don't consciously know why.
And the inverse of that. What happens if you withhold it?
The inverse is creating intentional visual anxiety. If you purposefully withhold that balance,
Yeah.
say if you flood a composition with a jarring, highly saturated lime green, and instead of pairing it with a soothing red to neutralize it, you pair it with a clashing magenta or a toxic yellow.
You are denying the eye its biological resting state.
Exactly. The cones fatigue, the after images start to fire, and the brain cannot find neutral ground. You induce a subtle state of physiological stress.
Which again goes back to harmony as effectiveness. If you are designing an album cover for an industrial metal band or a brutalist architectural poster, that physiological stress is exactly the emotional payload you want to deliver.
It is entirely manipulative.
It is. But it also highlights a massive practical problem. If human perception is this easily manipulated, this fragile, this context-dependent, how do we actually apply this in the real without accidentally triggering the Bezold effect or inducing unwanted visual anxiety?
You can't just throw colors at a canvas and hope the biology works out.
Right. We need practical systems.
You're absolutely right. Philosophy and biology are fascinating, but graphic design is a practical, applied discipline. We need dependable frameworks to rein in all of this chaos.
Which brings us to the final major area of the manual, designing with purpose. The text outlines several foolproof, systematic frameworks to help practitioners actually use this information reliably.
Let's start with the most structurally sound one, the dominant, subordinate, and accent system.
I feel like this is the industry standard structure for preventing optical chaos.
It really is. It completely bypasses the unpredictable nature of color relativity by enforcing strict mathematical proportions.
The rule is simple, right? You assign highly specific, rigid roles to your palette.
You cast them in a movie, and you enforce the hierarchy.
Exactly. You begin by selecting one dominant tone. This is the structural foundation of the design.
It is going to cover the vast majority of the surface area.
Okay.
And because it takes up so much space, it is usually a desaturated hue or a neutral value.
Right, because otherwise it would exhaust the viewer's retina. It just sets the baseline mood.
Then you cast the supporting actors.
The subordinate colors.
You might have one or two of these. They take up significantly less space than the dominant color. They exist purely to create categorical division, maybe defining the sidebar of a website or the secondary text blocks in a brochure.
They need to contrast with the dominant color enough to be legible, but they shouldn't fight it for attention.
And finally, you bring in the sniper.
The accent color.
The accent is your most highly saturated, aggressive hue. And because it is so pure and demanding, use it in microscopically small proportions.
A single buy now button.
Yes, one critical data point on a massive chart. A single word in a headline.
Because the volume of the dominant and subordinate colors is so controlled, that tiny drop of highly saturated accent color acts like a flare in the night sky.
The eye has no choice but to immediately lock onto it.
It leverages the biology of the cones perfectly. It gives them just enough pure wavelength to trigger attention without causing fatigue.
It's extremely effective.
The manual also details a fascinating approach called the meaning-based method. This feels like the ultimate hack for corporate design constraints.
It really is a mathematical solution to a subjective problem.
Right, because say you are an agency and a massive corporate client insists that you must use their legacy, highly specific corporate blue as the foundation of the new campaign.
It's a non-negotiable anchor.
How do you build a harmonious palette around a color you didn't choose? The manual says you find its exact complement on the color wheel, in this case, orange.
But you don't just slap a pure orange next to a pure blue.
Because that creates lateral inhibition and visual vibration.
Exactly. Instead, you mathematically invert their values and intensities. This is where understanding the four pillars saves the design.
Oh, I see.
If the mandated corporate blue is dark in value and highly saturated in chroma, you make the complementary orange incredibly light in value and highly desaturated.
Almost like a pale, dusty peach.
Exactly. You balance the scales.
You create immediate guaranteed harmony. You get the biological satisfaction of complementary hues, the blue and the orange neutralizing each other, but because you drastically separated their values, you eliminate the visual vibration. The structure remains intact.
It works every single time.
And the text also discusses progressive and repetitive systems, which basically rely on rhythm.
Using steady, mathematically calculated steps of dark to light value to guide the eye horizontally across a layout. It creates a sense of forward motion.
We're systematically repeating a specific hue at regular intervals to unify a chaotic, multi-page document. These are the practical mechanical tools you reach for when the blank canvas is staring back at you.
But there is a massive reality check the manual specifically addresses here, and it requires us to look beyond aesthetic frameworks and confront physical limitations.
Okay, I have to jump in here and issue a major pushback, because we have spent this entire deep dive mapping out the precise interactions of specific wavelengths.
Right.
We are agonizing over the tension between pure red and pure green, calculating after images, and tuning the exact saturation of an accent color.
Yeah.
But what happens to all of this elaborate biological manipulation if a huge percentage of the audience literally lacks the physical hardware to see the colors we are choosing?
This raises an important question. It's the ultimate accessibility test, and it brings us to the crucial discussion of color vision deficiency, commonly referred to as color blindness.
The text highlights a statistic that completely alters the math of visual communication here. Color blindness affects roughly 10% of the global population.
Predominantly men, due to how the genes responsible for photopigments are carried on the X chromosome.
10% is a massive, unavoidable chunk of the audience.
And we need to clarify what that actually means mechanically. Complete monochromatic color blindness achromatopsia, where a person truly only sees in shades of gray, is exceedingly rare.
So what are we primarily dealing with in design?
We are usually dealing with dichromacy or anomalous trichromacy.
The inability to distinguish between specific opposing hues.
Primarily red and green. In a condition like deuteropia, the viewer's green-sensitive cones are either missing or malfunctioning.
So the wavelengths still enter the eye, but the biological translator is broken.
Exactly. The red and green signals just collapse into each other.
Think about the catastrophic implications of that for data visualization.
It's huge.
If you design a critical financial dashboard and you use a pure medium value green to indicate profits are soaring and a pure medium value red to indicate the company is going bankrupt.
To 10% of your executives, that entire chart is just a solid, indistinguishable block of muddy, yellowish-brown data. The communication doesn't just fail, it becomes actively dangerous.
Which brings us all the way back to the very beginning. It proves exactly why the manual insists that a designer can never, ever rely on hue alone to convey critical structural information.
It all comes back to value.
It is the ultimate safety net.
If your design relies on a green indicator and a red indicator, you must alter their relative lightness and darkness.
Make the green a highly luminous, bright value, and make the red a deeply dark, heavy value.
Yes, because even if the viewer's biological hardware cannot process the difference in the wavelength frequency, their rods will instantly perceive the extreme contrast in lightness and darkness.
They will see a stark light gray against a stark dark gray.
The hierarchy is preserved. The information survives the biological failure.
Value is the structural steel. Even if the viewer is entirely blind to the wallpaper, the steel framework ensures they won't walk into a wall.
Precisely. Accessibility is not an afterthought. It is the ultimate stress test of your value structure.
That's a great way to put it.
But beyond the hard biological constraints of the optic nerve, the manual leaves us with one final, incredibly fluid variable to manage.
Cultural psychology.
Right, because colors don't just carry physical energy, they carry centuries of historical and cultural baggage.
The manual briefly mentions Pantone trend forecasts and how certain industries have deeply ingrained expectations about palettes.
The psychological weight of a color can completely override its biological intent, and it changes depending on the geographic and cultural context of the viewer.
Give me an example of that.
Well, in Western cultures, white is often associated with purity, cleanliness, and weddings.
Sure.
But in many Eastern cultures, white is the color of mourning and death.
Oh, wow. So if you take a purely biological approach and you design a highly luminous, pure white package because you want it to stand out on a shelf with high-value contrast,
You might accidentally signal a funeral to half your consumer base.
context is literally everything.
It is. If you are designing a brand identity for a high-end, luxury wealth management firm, you are constrained by the cultural expectation of stability, heritage, and seriousness.
You will lean into deep, desaturated navy blues, rich forest greens, and metallic values.
Right. If you try to build that wealth management brand using a chaotic, highly saturated palette of neon lime greens and hot pinks,
You violate the audience's ingrained psychological expectation. They will subconsciously register the brand as unstable, erratic, or immature, regardless of how perfectly you balance the complementary wavelengths.
but, and this is important, isn't there value in breaking those rules sometimes?
The manual does suggest that a designer's job is a constant tightrope walk between meeting expectations to build trust and purposefully subverting those expectations to force disruption.
Absolutely. Because if every wealth management firm uses navy blue, the market just becomes a sea of visual monotony.
So the designer who calculates the exact right moment to introduce a jarring, unexpected hue, maybe a highly saturated, energetic orange accent in a sea of conservative blue, disrupts the visual landscape.
They steal the viewer's attention. But you can only successfully subvert the rules once you have masterfully constructed the underlying value structure to support the disruption.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now, staring down your next visual project? If we synthesize the incredibly dense physics, biology, and psychology of this chapter down to a few ruthless, actionable laws.
Let's summarize it.
First, stop trusting your monitor. The physical temperature of your screen is lying to you. Calibrate it. Or the colors you think you were choosing don't actually exist.
Crucial step.
Second, realize that color is a highly volatile team sport. Never evaluate a hue in isolation on a pristine white background. Test your colors in the exact context they will be viewed, surrounded by their neighbors, because the Bezold effect is always waiting to ambush your composition and muddy the waters.
The relationships are everything.
And above all else, start relying on value over hue. Strip your design entirely of color. Look at it in pure black and white. If the hierarchy fails in grayscale, no amount of highly saturated, meticulously chosen complementary colors will save it. Build the steel framework of contrast first and paint the walls second.
That is the definitive operational summary right there. You have to respect the physical constraints of light, engineer around the biological realities of the eye, and anticipate the deeply subjective psychological weirdness of the human brain.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. We started this journey looking for certainty. We wanted color to be an objective, physical truth, a solid red brick we could just pick up and place in a design.
But that's just not how it works.
No. What the manual reveals instead is that color is a magnificent, highly orchestrated hallucination. It is an unstable mix of bouncing electromagnetic waves, biological translation errors, and deep psychological relativity.
But armed with the vocabulary of hue and saturation, and the systemic frameworks of value and dominant structures, you are now equipped to actually control that hallucination rather than being controlled by it.
It is a really powerful set of tools.
It is. But before we sign off, I actually want to leave you with one final lingering thought.
Okay, hit me.
It builds on the philosophy of Joseph Albers and the subjective nature of perception we were talking about earlier. We've established that color does not actually exist in the physical universe. It is only a qualia, a phenomena constructed entirely inside the dark void of our skulls as an interpretation of radiation.
Right.
And we've proven that the context of surrounding light can completely alter that internal interpretation.
The gray squares on the black and white backgrounds.
Exactly. So consider the classic philosophical problem of the inverted spectrum.
Okay.
Since my internal experience of a wavelength is entirely private, and your internal experience is entirely private, how can we ever truly prove that the vibrant, colorful reality we experience every single day is an objective truth we share?
Oh, man.
Right. When we both look at a clear summer sky and agree that it is blue, how do I know that the biological hallucination occurring in your mind isn't what I would call red?
Wow.
Are we actually sharing a visual reality, or are we all just walking around completely alone, trapped inside our own privately painted optical illusions?
That is, wow. The next time someone argues with you about whether a dress is blue and black or white and gold, just remember, neither of you is actually seeing reality. You're just experiencing different hallucinations.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of color. Look at the world a little differently today.